Hey, welcome back! Today I have a really important new CSS feature that I have to tell you about. And I can't stress enough how important this is. I mean, I wish this would have existed years ago already, because it would have made my life way less important. Or at least my CSS way less important. And that is exactly the message I want to get across today. And it's important for you to know. Why don't my styles get applied correctly? It's important. This style has to be important. Just do it. That's the struggle I had to live with for years already. But now we have something really nice, which is called CSS Cascading Layers. It might sound complicated, but it brings you so much. So let's stop with making this intro any more important and let's dive into it right away. The first thing that's good to know is if you look on my right, you see the Can I Use website, and CSS Cascade Layers are available in pretty much every browser. So why aren't you using it already? Let me quickly show you what it can do for you. What I created is a really ugly website with a few components that I put in there, which we are gonna style just a little bit better. As for the HTML or JSX part, there's just a few components with a few class names that we will touch in a second. And then we have our just plain CSS file that firstly imports our React daypicker styles. And then we have a global CSS reset that you would see in your own project as well. But it's just a small portion of it, it's not a complete reset. And then we have a few global styles to put things in center, and we also have a little bit of styling for the button component. And then we have this, what are these CSS Cascade Layers? Well, you can recognize them by the add layer prefix, where you can give this layer a name, for example, reset. Then you just use curly brackets like you, for example, also would in a media query, and then you can put any styles in there. So let's put our reset right in there. And that on its own doesn't do anything visual yet, but there is a few really important things happening here. If we would add one more layer, add layer test, for example, and we would add an H1 style in here as well, and we would, for example, say margin 20 pixels, then you see it gets applied. But that's also the same for CSS, right? If a style comes after it but has the same specificity, then it will automatically apply. However, what I can do with this layer is I can move it above the other layer, which will remove it at first. But if I then add another line at the top of our file where I say add layer, reset, test, then you see that it suddenly reverts again and that this 20 pixel is applied. Because what I'm doing here with this add layer is I'm specifying the order in which the layers will get applied, or the order in which they are important. So if I would swap that around again and add test in front of reset, then it will change it back to the reset layer being the most important. And I could now even comment this out and it will stay exactly the same, because the way these layers work is that the layer that comes first in your style is always the least important. The layer that comes next will be stacked over top of it. However, because that's a little bit confusing if you have a lot of code, you also have the option to specify these layers without adding any content yet, but that will already specify the order of your layers at the top of your file. So this is what you see most of the times. And in our case, let's add the reset back and then the test after it. And then again, you see that the margin of 20 pixels is applied. And now you might be asking, why is this really important? What does it do? Now, let's say that this reset is loaded in your project, but somehow ends up later in your bundle. What it would do is it would suddenly screw up all of your specificity and it might reset all of the margins. Even though you have this layer where you actually wanted the H1, all of your H1s in the project to have 20 pixels of margin. So by adding this layer, you always know for sure that your H1 has a 20 pixel margin no matter where it's added in your code. And all of that because you specified in the layer that the test layer, or perhaps we should already rename it to, for example, your base layer for all your global heading, paragraph styles, things like that. because that layer is more important than your reset. So that way, there is no risk of your reset getting rendered later in your style sheet. But you might be thinking, I'm a super good CSS developer. I don't need this. I know I put my CSS reset at the top and then everything will work. And of course you do. But let me show you a second use case where this can be really, really useful. Let's first copy this base layer and move it down just after our reset, simply because that's the order it's applied in and it looks a little bit better, but not because it changes anything of the functionality. I'm also gonna move the main and root styles into here as well, because I think it's also part of the base layer, but again, not because it will change anything in this example. Next, we have this button component. That button component should probably also be part of some layer, because if we don't add a layer to this, it will always be the most important layer after all of the other layers have been defined. Even if it would have been right in between here, for example, it would still be the most important thing. So let's create another layer called components. And then we're going to wrap the button in our components layer. So far, so good. Nothing special. But let's say in our base layer, we also want to implement some logic that if there is a button next to another button, we also want to give it some margin on the left side. So you could, for example, do that by adding dot button plus dot button, and then say margin left 20 pixels. And then you already see that there's suddenly a gap between the two buttons. That's perfectly fine, right? However, if you now look at that button, you see that the second button has a margin left class of 12. So if we would add that class and, for example, add that to our base layer for now as well, margin left 12, and just give it margin left of, it doesn't really matter for now, 60 pixels, so we see what happens. Because what happens is nothing. And why is that? If we inspect this and then inspect the second button and make stuff a little bit bigger, then you see that our button styles are applied with padding, border, and you also see the layer that's specified, by the way. And then you see our base layers applied. Both the button plus button as well as the margin left class are in this base layer. And you see that the margin left is strike true. It's disabled. And that is because the specificity of this class is higher than the margin left class. So there's multiple ways to solve this, of course, but there's more than enough people who would simply do important, ta-da, it works, let's call it a day. And that's exactly my point, because then you start to run into all of these specificity issues. That's just a never-ending story. And from that point on, your code will become messier and messier. And now with these cascade layers, there's actually a really simple fix, so you don't need any important. And that is simply by copying this and creating a new layer, for example, utilities, where we paste this margin left in. And you immediately see that it's still applied, even though there is no important here. Even though I did not add it to the top of this list. Because if you don't add it here, the importance will simply be the moment it's first discovered in your CSS. But to be really specific, it's important to also add your utilities as a last in here as well. So that way it's really clear when which layer is rendered. Because if I would now take these utilities and add it in front of the base, you see that the buttons have a tinier margin again. And that is because the base layer is now more important than the utilities, and you see that this base style is now applied and the margin left isn't. If we revert that again, you see that the layer utilities is the top layer again, and that it's actually applied. And you can even click this utilities layer, which will then show you all of the layers that are applied on the page. And also here you can see we have the reset, base, components, and utilities. And this is such a powerful feature, because now you can make these utility classes always be the most important thing. So if you would add a utility class on something that, for example, already has a margin, you don't need to worry about the importance of the selector in a specific layer. Because no matter the importance of the previous layer, if you add a new layer and the selector is less important, it will still be more important because of the layer it is in. And that is the reason why, even though this margin left selector is less important than the button plus button, it still overrides, simply because it's a new layer. And that could, for example, also go for these paragraphs in here. If you look at the HTML, you see that there's a rich text clause on the article. So for example, this could be text coming from a CMS. And what you want to do is you want to style all of the paragraphs in there and give it a margin bottom. So you would go to your base layer and say rich text, then all the paragraphs in there have a margin bottom of 12 pixels. Or actually, let's make it 24 so it's a bit more visible. And then that's simply applied. But if we now go back, you also see that there's one that has a class name large. Might not be the best class name, but it suffices for now. But if we would go back and go to our utilities layer, add this large on here, and then add a margin bottom of 60 pixels, for example, and then add font size of 24 pixels, then that is applied. But if this same large class would be inside of our base layer, it wouldn't be applied, or at least the margin bottom suddenly isn't, because this selector is more important than the next one. But again, by moving this into our new utilities layer, we are able to override this, and it becomes so much easier to know what the order of importance is of our CSS. And to me, that really makes CSS just a bit more accessible again, because all of a sudden, all these cascading issues become less of an issue. There's new ways to solve this instead of using important, which would start to break everything. There's one more thing I still want to show you, and that is using this in combination with external packages. Because down here, I'm using the React Daypicker library. And you also see that in the styles, I imported their styles. And it looks okay-ish. There's some things I could tweak because the text is white when you hover it, but that's okay. What I want to change though in this is, instead of having the text in the center and the buttons on the outside, I actually want to move the text of the right calendar to the right and the left calendar also to the left. And for that I need to change a few things, because if you look at this arrow and we inspect it, then you see that this is position absolute. So we need to revert that position absolute. However, they're using quite a specific selector to set these styles. So in order to override that, we would also need to implement all of these class names in order to be specific enough to override it. Or what unfortunately also happens a lot with all of these vendor libraries is that you would write RDP nav and then position relative, for example, and then again use important. And I have seen and even used myself this more than once, maybe even more than 100 times in my career, simply because there isn't really a better option. I think the React Daypicker is actually still an easy library to override, but there's way more complicated and frustrating examples out there that really make it impossible to override. And of course, because of the topic of this video, we can solve this now with Cascade Layers. The first step is also assigning this import to a layer. And you can do that by, after the import, writing the layer as a function where you, for example, add vendor in there. And then, simply because I like to specify my layers at the top so it's really clear what applies where and you can't overlook this, I'm going to move the layers to the top now. And I'm also going to add vendor as the very first layer. Or maybe even you want to do the reset first and then you want to add your vendor style. So now this import is in its own layer. Because if you look at our styles, you see that the layer vendor is applied here as well. And you also see that our nav style is ranked higher. So even if I would now remove the important, it would still work. And that is because right now our RDP nav style is outside of any layer, which means that it's, like I said before, the most important layer. But even if we would copy this and move it, for example, inside components, it would still apply because components is a later in the order than our vendor styles, without us needing to write any overrides. And that is really important because this all of a sudden makes it so much easier to override these styles without having to write any important on there. Simply because our styles are now more important because of the layer. And that makes writing these styles so much easier. Isn't that great? I really hope that with these 3 examples, I was able to show you the power of CSS Cascade Layers. And that is really something you probably should start using. Even if it's only for these vendor files, simply because it makes your life so much easier. But I also have a second video coming up about this exact same topic, where we will actually dive into a really specific library that I think is super annoying to override. But all of a sudden, because of Cascade Layers, becomes a breeze to work with and might be a super interesting library for you to dive into. So definitely subscribe to this channel if you want to see that video as well, because it will be releasing soon. But that only leaves me with one thing, and that is thanking you for watching this video again. Please leave a like if you enjoyed this video, and then I will hope to see you in the next video.